Hello, everyone, and hi, Tyree. Your last name is pronounced Awewo, which I really love. It's great to have you on the show. We're going to jump straight into things here. We have a live audience tuning in live from LinkedIn, and there's going to be a Q&A portion. So to those who want to ask questions, you're going to get a chance to ask Tyree here in a second. But Tyree, we're going to jump straight into things. You've had a pretty diverse career. You're a graduate of the Harvard Business School. You've had a career at McKinsey, and you've even started your own company. So could you tell, and now of course you're leading initiatives at Hugo, which is fascinating and the conversation that we're going to have together today, but could you talk about what pulled you into the world of outsourcing and BPO to kick things off here?
Yeah, and that's a great question, right? And I actually don't get asked that question a lot. But taking a step back, I think what pulled me into the world of outsourcing was this concept of future of work. I've always been fascinated by the intersection of technology and how it impacts human lives and the kind of opportunities it creates. And my career path has always been closely aligned with that, whether it was as an engineer where I designed algorithms, then I got my MBA, and then at McKinsey, I would say there was less technology and more about helping companies transform the operations. But then I did my startup, which was basically technology and fashion, right? And helping people make better choices using technology. And so when this opportunity came along, I was fascinated because, take a few steps, a few years back to COVID, where we all know how sort of like COVID reshaped the way people do work, right? And a lot of it was around realizing that remote working wasn't actually a barrier. It could actually be an enabler for teams in certain places because then you could access work with talent from all around the world. And so for me, this whole idea of being able to work with a company that could be part of shaping the next 5, 10 years of work by helping companies solve problems with a workforce that was primarily in Africa, for me, that was intriguing. So I think that was what got me to pay attention.
I love that. And let's spend some time maybe talking about the future of work.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the next 5, 10 years. What does that exactly look like to you? Where do you think that's headed? You mentioned companies outsourcing in places like Africa, where I understand you have an active workforce of over 4,000 some
Yes.
people. Um, what does that future look like? Could you explain that?
Yeah. So I think about the future of work is actually shaped by two things, right? That are happening right now as we speak, right? Well, one happened a few years ago. I think the first was this embrace of remote working and people just being open to working with teams that are distributed globally, right? And you're no longer limited by physical location. So call that as a factor that made people more open to working in a different way. And then the second is this explosion of technology with AI and machine learning and LLMs, right? Which allow us to do the same person to do a lot more work, right? It's also shifted work where now a lot of the simple stuff can be automated, and now what you're left with is work that is much more complicated, much more nuanced, requires more judgment, more thinking, right? And so I would say that those two factors for me are two big things that are shaping what work will look like in the future. And so while a lot of people right now are talking about how AI is taking away jobs, I see it as AI is taking away the simple stuff and allowing people to focus on adding value in a very specific way. So I'd say that the future of work is going to evolve along those lines. We're going to start seeing that in different industries. I would say certain industries, there will be fewer people. A lot of industries, people will just be required to solve a lot more complex problems. I believe that this will mean that there will be an acceleration in innovation across all levels, not just AI innovation, but just it's going to allow us push things much more further because now we're spending 30, 40, 50%, actually probably more like 60, 70% of our time on what I consider to be simple, non-value adding work. It's just more like stuff you have to do to get the work done. Now, 100% of your capacity can be spent on what used to be 30% of your capacity. So it's like 3x more work per person, and that should mean an acceleration in innovation. So that's kind
Right.
of how I see it.
No, I love that because at 50 Pros, we also advocate for, we think the future of work includes more contracted firms, more contracted agencies. And a big reason for this is because as sort of things evolve, you might not need a full-time, a set of employees for a specific task. You might need a component here, a component there, and you might want
Yes.
to optimize your workforce strategy to meet those requirements. But in general, why do you think, because some companies are sort of convinced in a more traditional way of going down the employee route, having these specific set parameters. What's the case on why companies want to outsource in the first place? How do you kind of come in there? You mentioned the remote workforce. How do you sell that? I guess if you're talking to a client, they're like, no, we have these employees. We want to do it this way. We want them to come in the office Monday through Friday. How do you sell saying, hey, you know what? These people want to be remote. You might not need them from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, 12 months of the year. You might want them just for a 3 months project here or on a case by case basis. We call it metered usage.
Yeah.
How do you typically approach that? And what do you say?
Yeah, I mean, there are multiple questions that you're asking me right there, and each of them is actually a fairly meaningful question, right? So maybe I'll start with the easy one, which is why do companies historically outsource, and how is that changing, right? So I would say that the predominant reason people typically outsource is cost savings. So yeah, it can be you can get people to do the same work for 30 to 50% less. And this is typically work that is well defined. You've done it before a million times. So it's really just taking the work from who's doing it, moving it to a different location, and suddenly it's cheaper, right? Then you also get expertise, right? Someone who has done it multiple times for many companies can typically do it better, right? Because they solved the problem 100 times before. There's speed and flexibility. If a company decides suddenly that they don't need this type of work anymore, it's like a month or two, and you can basically shift your entire workforce. Whereas with an in-house, there are much more considerations. I think another one is also like access to global talent. There's certain types of work that have geographical advantages. So you can be like, oh, in this country of the world, you get more of X, Y, Z, and so people have taken advantage of that and outsourced. What we're now seeing is that additional reasons why people are outsourcing now is this point you brought up, which is flexibility, which is in the past, people are used to full-time contracts, they hire people, they bring them in-house, but now work is getting much more, I would say, fragmented, where you need a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, right? And so if you were to bring all those people in-house, you only need 20% of this, 100% of that, 50% of that, like it's just, you're paying 3x, right? But now you can, with outsourcing companies or with, I would say, remote contracts or with, metered pay, which is I hadn't actually heard that concept before, but it's actually an apt description. You can basically pick and choose and stitch together something that is a little bit more, I would say, tailored to your exact needs. And then when those needs evolve, which we're in a world that's evolving very fast, you can also shift to someone else. And each of those providers who's providing that work, a lot of times people have platforms, and so they're also, deploying their workforce over a wide range of companies. Each of them needs a little bit, right? And so they almost end up approximating full-time work, but then you're just getting that full-time work from many different pieces and from many different companies.
Right.
Yeah.
It's so true. I was speaking to a startup friend of mine, and you're mentioning the fragmented aspect. It's so true because he was talking about setting up like a customer support team, and the product hadn't even been launched yet. There was no marketing behind it. It's like, why would you bring on a customer support team of 1, 2, 3 people? You're gonna have like 2 tickets, customer support tickets coming in like per day. There's just not enough volume
Yeah.
to justify someone sitting there being on call, for the whole day to accept phone calls. It just didn't make any sense. Whereas when you go with an outsourced approach, is kind of, you could do based on that metered usage. You might not need a full-time payroll, someone to be sitting there answering calls, just kind of on a case-by-case basis, which I think it provides a lot of flexibility, provides lower risk too. So I really love that you're describing that.
I will tell you this though, that we are probably still quite a few years away from that sort of like fractional flexibility, where you're able to get flexibility on a less than one person, right? And more, what we're actually seeing more is more around flexibility from being able to build diverse teams of people, right? So before, what you had to do was, you needed, to outsource complex physics work. You went to someone who did that, right? Or you hired a bunch of physics people, right? And the type of work you typically outsource was simple, generalist work that can be done by anyone who had the right processes. Now, what companies are wanting is that they're wanting to be able to go to one place, for example, and be able to get, say they needed 50 people, right? They need an extension of their team. They want to be able to say, do a la carte. I need 1 of this, 5 of this, X, Y, Z. And by the way, as our company evolves and our needs change, we ideally want to go to a single place to fulfill those needs, as opposed to having to build, go to 50 different places to fulfill those needs, right? So I'd say that's kind of like the intermediate piece of the puzzle, on the way to evolve into being able to take a person, right, and basically carve out their time into as many different bits and pieces.
Right. I love that. So let's talk a little bit about that. You mentioned kind of a more larger workforce for maybe more complex projects,
Yeah,
separate for our audience, separate from the freelancer, where you might need a very discrete project for like 3 hours. This
exactly.
is much broader projects, larger scope of work, etc. So you've worked with Hugo specifically, has had clients, Meta, some pretty big names.
Yeah,
What are some of those use cases if you could speak on them? You mentioned AI is a big thing that you're pretty deeply involved in. What are
yeah.
some of these projects? What kind of workforce is required? What are companies looking to achieve?
Gotcha. So there's a wide range of workers. So I'll give you a couple of examples of where we've used AI, right? And how it used to be done before and how it's being done now. So an easy one is with voice, call center work, right? So how it typically works with call center work is that you have your agents who are taking calls, you have your quality assurance people who are listening on calls, ensuring that people are taking the calls well, the right empathy, the right tone, the right processes, and you have a couple of other people who are looking at different pieces of optimizing the workforce to drive the right outcomes,
Okay.
speed, quality, customer satisfaction. So QA is a very good example. It was typically reactive. You were listening to calls and you were giving coaching based on that, right? And you could typically only do, I would say, anywhere between 10 to 20% of the calls maximum, right?
Right. And are
So,
these calls, by the way, are they being outsourced with Hugo, or are these internal employees and Hugo's providing back end
ah,
support?
so
What?
this is outsourced. So just imagine you're calling your bank because you have an issue, right? You need
Right.
tech support for something, right? A package is lost, you're calling, right? So that type of work, right? Now, with AI, what you can do with QA is that instead of having to listen to 10 to 20% of the calls, you can listen to 100% of the calls,
Mhm.
right? You can do it, and it can be done using transcripts, right? And it will literally QA and tell you this person off the
Right.
100 calls they took, this is the scores, these are the improvement areas, and it can do that after the fact using the transcripts. It can do that live, right? And
Right.
live during the call, it can tell you, sentiment of the call. This customer is angry, therefore, because they're angry, here is how you should be addressing the calls, right? So it allows you get better outcomes from a QA perspective, but it also allows you get better coverage, right?
Right. I see.
And that for me is a classic example of how AI can transform. And that's an easy one, right? And that's one type of work, right? The other types of work are, for example, you're working with, say, a platform that is having to solve for, fraud or risk, right? And so there, it's about there are many different pieces. You need to be able to look at someone's, history, their ID. They're like almost like 5 or 6 different pieces of information, all from different sources, right? And we're
Right.
able to aggregate that, right? And have almost like more data, and then the human then applies judgment to that data to make a better outcome that allows you to solve for a better customer experience. You weed out the bad actors, and it's just better for everyone because then
Right.
you lower the cost of fraud, which means that you can pass it on to your customers. You have a better experience for the platform. So that's the middle. And then at the end side, this is where we're actually fine tuning the AI systems, right? Which, back in the day, it was about saying, if this is a question, we will have what we call human evaluators who will say, here are the right answers, right? And it could
Right.
be general questions, it could be related to like a subject like math or law and the rest. And now all that work, most of that work has been done. Now what we're seeing is that we're like trying to tune the systems to give like hyper specific, very tailored answers, right? So this is where we get a model that says, there are 2 models. They tell us, here is a question. This model gives this answer. This model gives this other answer. We
Wow.
want you
Okay.
to look at both those answers. We want you to score the responses based on some sort of rubric, which can be as much as like 40 pages. I mean, it's super complicated, right?
Wow.
And we want you to say, here's why this answer was good or not good. Here's what the specific problem was. Here are some comments, right? And
Mhm.
then we want you to compare the new model versus the old model and come up with what we call which one is superior, why it's superior, right?
I
And
love
to
that.
it's mind-blowingly complex stuff, right? But this is
Right.
kind of where we are with AI right now, and this is what's going to allow us transition to the future of work.
Right.
So
And just so
pretty
I
great.
understand that last part correctly, while there's a call rep speaking to a customer, the AI
Yes.
is then providing a few different options of how to. Is that real time that you have to score it, or is that after the fact, after the call is ended, that you go in to assess what the correct responses were? Is
Yes.
that is it real time kind of response? Is that what
So you
how
see
that?
both, right? And again, this is where, as providers of that work, we are constantly looking for technology partners, and every day there's something new and we're
Right.
evaluating them, right? So we've seen some real-time stuff. I would say that real-time stuff is still kind of still, it's not quite there yet, right?
Right.
Most of it is after the fact, right? And basically being able to look at how people performed and say, here's how you should have resolved it, here's what you need to do to be better, right?
I got you.
And actually QA is shifting from helping individual agents to being better towards more of a system. How can you move around people or change your overall responses tone across an entire group of people to drive overall better outcomes, right? And you have statistics in there, you have predictive analysis, all of that stuff, right? And I mean, this is stuff that took teams and teams of people to do, and you'd only be able to do a third of that work.
Right. So
It's a
I'm
big shift.
curious, do you think the future is, I mean, if you look at a few patterns, and I'm a big advocate for, humans, if you will, right? But
Yeah.
if you look at what's happening, I'd hope so. But what's happening to, Uber, they're starting to replace their drivers, right? You have Waymo's coming in. They're piloting it in San Francisco. They're piloting it in Phoenix. There is a lot of concern about, AI is going to replace, many types of roles. Um, and call centers are one of those things. Interestingly enough, I've seen that companies aren't actually looking to use AI when it comes to call centers. I think there was a huge misconception, I think years ago. And that just hasn't been the case. I think companies largely, and we have data on this, they're
Yeah.
preferring to speak to, by and large, real people. I have some thoughts on this, but I want to hear your thoughts. Where do you think it's headed?
Yeah. I mean, I have some thoughts, right? And it evolves over time, right? And I have thoughts as a, someone who works in the industry, but also someone who's just deeply passionate about technology, but really cares about human impact, because that's why I'm at Hugo, right? Hugo,
Right.
we're employing thousands of people, and that's important to us, right? Um, So I fundamentally believe that there will be, society as a whole will be better, right? But there are going to be some short-term real problems that we're going to have to grapple with, which is that there are certain things that people are doing right now and they don't no longer need to do anymore. If we think back to, I don't know, 70, 80 years ago when the calculator was invented, there were people whose jobs, they were human calculators, right?
Right.
There were makers of companies who made slide rules, right? And all these things that helped with human calculations. What happens when the calculator came, right? It a lot of those industries got decimated. Human calculators suddenly lost their jobs or couldn't do those jobs anymore, right? But
Right.
what we saw was that now, because we're able to do much more calculations, a whole bunch of use cases we never thought about, just basically evolved, right? And now we were now solving how to create computers, and that's what led to the microprocessor industry and computers, and the rest is history, right? And a lot of opportunities created there, right? Same thing with mechanized farming, right? Then you had human beings who were doing the work. Now you have all these automated farm equipment that's doing all the work, right? And you know people lost jobs in the short term, but now as a whole, society is better because we have much more productive agriculture systems. And so I
So
prefer to look at things from what opportunities are being created. And I think that we should spend more energy on saying, what what are we freeing human beings to be able to do, right? Are there more problems we should be solving? We live in a world with 8 billion people, right? And more than a third of them are hungry every day, right? Could we spend more time solving those problems? And can that result in a better, more equitable society for people? But I have
yeah,
to say that this is the ideal, and we know that in the short term there are people who are going to capitalize on this, push for lower costs, and yeah. So
yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think with the advances of technology, it elevates humanity. It sets us free from doing a lot of things that we otherwise may have been tied down to. One of my favorite stories on this, I'll share really briefly, is the Luddites, based out of England. Have you heard of the story of the Luddites in the 1800s?
no, actually, I mean I've heard the term, right?
Right.
What? Yes,
Yeah,
simple. Yeah.
it was pretty fascinating because this is back when printing presses were, humans had to kind of, every time they were, you know, pressing magazines and newspapers, they had to press it down. With the rise of these presses to automate some of these processes, to do it in scale, do a much more affordable, and didn't require so much human labor. And it was bad work. I mean, these people were kind of in the warehouses, if you will, and they set factories on fire because they were protesting. uh,
Wow.
yeah, there was a huge revolt, a huge riot. They were setting it on fire, and it's funny because this was 250 years ago. People were saying, machines are replacing our jobs. 2025, people are saying the exact same things, and it's just not the case. as we kind of saw, is that it elevated everyone's standards of living. They wanted
Yep.
to do more meaningful work, better things. So it's funny because a lot of the answers of the future are in the past. So
Yeah.
what you're describing rings true in there, and there's historical evidence for this as well.
Absolutely, and I think that maybe on some level, right, what's missing, right, and I'll give I'll tie it back to the work we do at Hugo. What's missing is that there's not enough central shaping of the narrative. We're letting narratives shaped by different players of the industry, and what we need isn't a narrative that's a piece of the puzzle. You need more of the full puzzle, right?
Right,
Where you're talking about impact on society as a whole, not necessarily on the people who are short term losers, the people who are short term winners, right? No, it's more like let's think about it from a society perspective, right? I can definitely say for at Hugo that what we're seeing is that even though our workforce has grown over time, the types of work we are doing is shifting,
right,
and people are doing more complicated, more meaningful work, right? So it's like I think the Luddite example is a really, really powerful one because I'm sorry, no one wants to really be sitting down and just
right,
stamping something
right,
over and over again, back bent over, right?
right,
And so the question is, some of traditional outsourcing work was that equivalent? It was work no one wanted to do, right? And what we're seeing now is that we're doing more work that is more meaningful, and we're operating less as, oh, you're an arm's length outsourcer who's just doing this pushing this button in some place in the world that we don't care about, but just do the work. Don't get our customers upset.
right,
Towards actually, we are your partners. We're an extension of your team. We integrate with you more regularly. We talk to you more regularly. It's a two-way flow of ideas and information, and because it's two-way, we're actually able to solve problems better, more meaningful ways. Advance your customer and your business outcomes in very tangible ways, right? And so it's weird in the sense that what actually got us to this point was, I mean, yeah, we started Hugo with the goal of doing outsourcing differently, but I would say without remote work, without the explosion of LLMs, I don't know that we would have ever got the opportunity because historically, outsourcing is always backward looking. You only outsource that which has been done to the nth degree, and all because it's a risk mitigation thing, right, and a cost
right,
play. But
right,
because of the explosion of LLMs, we had to build a workforce that was able to solve these complex problems. We had to build a workforce that was very flexible and it could adapt and change. And so for us, maybe my perspective is very rosy because we are benefiting from this shift, is that we're doing more meaningful work. We're helping companies take the next step. We're operating as extension of their teams. And therefore, we get to see the opportunity very differently. And we're also starting from a small base. I mean, we're 4,000 people. Some of these outsourcing giants have 70, 80,000 people, and 80, 90% of their work is what I call traditional outsourcing that I would say AI is set to replace, right? So they have more of an existential crisis, whereas we see it as an
right.
opportunity. But I think there's a lot to learn from history of the past, and to say, how can you have to disrupt yourself. You can't wait for someone else to do it for you. So,
Right. Love that. So let's talk about, because you are internationally focused and you have a fairly large presence in Africa. What was the reason for this? Headquartering there, as I understand, the team is a large team
yes.
is based out of there. Could you speak on that and kind of what opportunities you're creating for companies in the U.S. and globally, and really the implications there in
Gotcha.
Africa?
So I'll start with the why Africa, right? And it's really a very simple answer. It's where our founders, or at least one of our founders, is from, right? So he was born and raised there, just like I was, and a few of our senior team members, right? So him being from there meant that when he was thinking about impact, because he's always like hugely driven by just impact and just accelerating impact in human lives, it makes sense to go home to a place where right? But then but
Right.
if the macroeconomic environment, the demographic trends didn't support this, then he wouldn't have been able to build this, right? So
Mhm.
historically, Africa has the world's, and in certain markets, so in certain countries in Africa, so Nigeria being one of them, Kenya being one of them, South Africa, but primarily West and Eastern Africa, people just love education. We are overeducated people, so young,
Mhm.
overeducated, and very like digitally native population, but then underemployed, right? So there's opportunities, but it might
Right.
not be the right opportunities that are tuned to the sort of like skill set of this new generation of people. And so it was almost like a match made in
Right.
heaven. He's from there, but then the demographics support a new sort of outsourcing. And that was kind of where those two ideas came together. And then he decided to start. started off small, and first few clients,
Mhm.
people are like, well, again, outsourcing is traditionally very risk averse, so they're like, no one's going to get fired for outsourcing to India or to Philippines, right? But Africa, are you kidding, right? Doesn't matter how many
Right,
degrees or
right.
how articulate people are, it's just a risk thing, right? And so we had to
Mhm.
partner mostly with startups because they were just more open-minded. They didn't care about history. They just cared about, can you solve my
I
problem? If
see.
you can solve it, great.
What exactly is the risk? You mentioned between India, that's the
Yes.
more, the more traditional one, if you will. Why do you think that risks exists, and what opportunities
So for me,
lie
it's
there?
actually less of an actual inherent risk and more of just a risk perception. Risk in for
I see. Okay.
traditional, I would say large enterprises or traditional outsourcing is, has it been done before here? If the answer is no, no one
I see.
cares. They like literally don't care. They're just like,
Right, right,
if you may be the best thing since sliced bread, right? But if we go with someone in the Philippines and it goes sideways, they'll be like, oh, well, that's fine, right? But if we go with an unproven
right.
commodity, right, and something goes wrong, then people kind of could get a little bit, this is your job on the line, right? And so there was less willingness
Mhm.
early on. And so what we had to do was we had to go with players who were more open-minded, right? And it was like two sets of players. You were either a startup, just dynamic, no history, no entrenched sort of like knowledge base. You just wanted to do stuff the best way. Great, we partner with you. We do it in the best way. We over deliver. We do
Right.
things in unscalable, unsustainable ways because for us it was more about solving the problem and getting the chance to make impact so that we could prove that we deserve a seat at the table. And then similarly,
Mhm.
on the large enterprise side, it was more because it was LLMs. No one had done this stuff before, right? So it didn't matter if you had been doing outsourcing for 20 years. I'm sorry, you haven't done this work before. And
Right.
so the larger, more established enterprises struggled to keep up, whereas we were willing to do whatever. And combination of those two just allowed us to build a business and a reputation of delivering, over delivering, and doing complicated work. So
Mhm.
that's kind of why.
Yeah, no, and I think that's great. And there's geographical advantages as well, right? You mentioned, some of the population is overeducated. That's both a good thing and a bad thing, right? You also want people, like you mentioned, to be in the right roles where they're not feeling like they're above, kind of where they should be, or rather below where they should be. So I love what Hugo's doing in that capacity, is bringing them, equipping them to do, meaningful work, and 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 doing great things for them as well. So I think it's
Yeah,
fantastic.
and maybe just one piece of the puzzle, right? You just brought up a really, really important point, which is that maybe if we're trying to do this 10 years ago, it wouldn't have worked because when you have a more educated workforce, also the desire to do more meaningful problems is there, right? And so if you're trying to be like, oh, well,
Right,
you are this physics PhD, but all I need you to do is press this button, right? And just press it, and they're like,
right,
well, but should there be a button? No, 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 no. Just press the button, right?
right,
Whereas right
right.
now, because the work has gotten more complicated, it's evolving fast, then
Yep.
they're actually having to do much more meaningful things, right? Which then means that people are more satisfied. Oh, and also
Right.
because it's not an outsourcing, it's not an established outsourcing market, right? At least not right now. This thing that plagues places like Philippines, where people are retention, like sorry, attrition is over 100%. Literally every year you turn over your workforce. There's so much
Oh,
competition,
wow.
right? And there's this story that they said there are these really large, skyscrapers with thousands of people, and maybe half of the building is one outsourcer, the other half is another outsourcer. People would leave for their lunch break and go get a job in the other outsourcer and basically start up. Like it's
Wow,
insane, right? But it doesn't matter if you're
wow.
outsourcing work that is very simple and you're just pressing a button. Whereas with us, we're
Right,
one of the top employers, which means that our people are staying 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, which means you can invest in educating, which means that workers can get more skilled over
right.
time, right? So again, it's partly Hugo, but it's also partly the environment we're operating in, right? So everyone just plays to their strengths. It just
Mm.
happens to be one of ours. So
I think that's great. I mean, the opportunities are there, and what Hugo and the team and what you guys have all accomplished is fantastic. We are going to turn it over to the Q&A portion, and then we'll wrap it up with a few rapid fire
all
fun
right.
questions. I do see some people have come up on stage, so I'm gonna bring up our first Q&A. Your videos are off. Eric Mulvin, I'm gonna bring you up first here. Here we go. Hi, Eric. You're welcome to ask your
Hi
question.
there. I don't have any question. I was just attending here. I know I'm not in a good spot without the camera off. Sorry.
Well,
Sure,
nice to
no,
have you, Eric.
no problem. We'll bring it back down. We'll bring up the next person. I see we have, uh, it's Oia. If it's I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but hi there. You're welcome to ask your question.
Hi there. I also don't I'm not in a good spot with video, but would love to. I didn't join at the beginning, but would love to understand what do we think the primary the value proposition of Hugo is relative to the other outsourcers you mentioned, sort of in India and the Philippines. Why do you think Hugo has the right to win over the next 5 to 10 years versus some of the more established players in these markets?
Okay, that was a bit of a softball, Ray. Are you sure you didn't plan that?
No, that's
Okay.
I
All
don't know.
right.
That was
So yes, let me try and answer that question, right? So I'll say Hugo and other built for purpose BPOs, so people who are built over the past few years to handle current and future work, um, I believe that we're better positioned because our workforces are younger, more educated, and basically able to handle much more complicated work, which is the kind of work we're seeing now that AI is getting rid of or replacing all the very simple work. So you need a workforce that can handle complex stuff, is dynamic, and basically can work with AI to produce better outcomes for companies. And I think that that's where Hugo is really well positioned to do and will continue to do.
great. Love that. And then it looks like Aaron did raise or Eric. Sorry about that. We got you back on. Eric,
All
good to
right.
see you again.
I'm ready now.
Feel free to
Sorry.
ask.
So I'm curious, where do you see the future of work for BPOs? I started a call center up in the Philippines 10 years ago, and there's a lot of these big employers that have 5,000 employees, 10,000. They have huge workforces, and I really wonder, what are they going to be doing with these big workforces? I don't see them really educating them, doing anything to prepare them for future jobs. Is a push just to go into other countries where, hey, they got the skills that we need. We don't have to really retool retool the people, because we're trying to figure out what to do with our people too, and we're trying to retool them, retrain them on these skills. But it's an interesting challenge, when some of them don't want to go along the journey with you as you show them the new way of doing things and where things are going. But curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really, really tough existential question, right? And I think that the right answer is you need to retool your work. You need to retrain your workforce, right? If you have a captive workforce, they're there. First of all, you need to sell them on the long-term vision that's about survival, right? And then you need to make the investments in them, right? And that means that in the short term, there's a cost associated with that, right? But in the long term, you have a workforce that their skill set is shifted and then they're able to do more work dynamically. I also think that the nature of work that they're used to doing, where it's like a long contract, they do the same type of work for long periods of time, that mindset also needs to shift towards like, hey, you may end up working on this for 3 weeks, or this may be 6 weeks, this may be a day, right? And just training the mindset to be able to handle a wider range of work, but then also to be much more flexible in how you think about work. And then finally, to be more outcome focused. So to be able to think about what outcome are we trying to drive as opposed to what process am I following, right? Because that's what people care about. So maybe those are 3 things.
Cool.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you, Eric. All right, Tyree, we're gonna close off here with some rapid fire questions, just a short answer for each, and then we'll wrap things up. But so far, I mean, it's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much. So here are some questions to wrap it up here. What's your favorite productivity hack?
ChatGPT and Notion. Yes.
Yeah, nothing beats it. And what's the best book that you've read recently?
The Bible.
Oh, okay. I love that. Okay, good. Very good. And then the next one was actually going to be what's one tool you can't live without, but it looks like you've already answered that with ChatGPT. What's another one besides Notion too?
Let's see, ChatGPT, Notion. I also use Grain, which is for automated, basically transcribing meetings, and I then pass it into ChatGPT, action items, and the rest. But it's perfect for memory recall. So
Great. Sounds good. Well, all right, to our audience tuning in live, we're going to wrap it up here. If you would like to get in touch with Tyree and his team, the contact information will be provided in the post episode email. Tyree, thank you so much for this discussion and conversation. It's been a complete pleasure, and I think we've discussed some fascinating topics. You've accomplished so many wonderful things. I know the best is yet to come. So looking forward to how things progress and advance. And we'll wrap it up here. Happy Friday. Have a great weekend, everyone. And
thank
Tyree,
you so much, Ray.
much.
Happy Friday, everyone, and take care. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.